Greetings, fellow traveler of the night, and welcome to this evening's serene excursion to the pages of time. As you prepare to drift into a night of peaceful rest, I invite you to join me on a voyage back through the epics, an era of brave knights and formidable fortresses, where sovereigns and consorts govern immense territories from glittering, gem-encrusted seats of authority. Before we commence our historical account, I'm eager to discover your location tonight and the current time in your particular corner of the planet. Feel welcome to leave a comment and share. It's always a pleasure to witness the wide array of this tranquil, history-loving community. And if these calming journeys into the past appeal to you, please think about subscribing so you're always able to relax or fall asleep easily. Now, settle in comfortably, dear friend. Perhaps you are currently tucked under sumptuous blankets or reclining on a soft armchair. As your eyelids begin to feel heavy and your breathing deepens, allow my voice to transport you gently across the centuries to a time both familiar and vastly different. Here, we'll glimpse behind the imposing stone ramparts of magnificent strongholds and into the daily routines of the people who once resided there. Our focus tonight is medieval Europe, spanning the period from the decline of the Roman Empire in the 5th century until the flourishing of the Renaissance in the 15th. It was a period marked by profound piety and prevalent superstition, by disease and development, by large-scale invasions and holy military campaigns. Looming powerfully over this ever-changing milieu were the crowned heads of Europe, the dukes and duchesses, the kings and queens, who assert a divine mandate to rule by the grace of a higher power. From their elaborate, bejeweled headwear to their ermine-trimmed vestments, the symbols of medieval royal power continue to captivate our modern imagination. When we visualize these ancient rulers, it's very simple to picture them in a veil of almost unfathomable extravagance, eternally celebrating and dancing, hunting and hawking, conducting military campaigns and establishing peace, all while adorned in fine silks and laden with precious gems. But what was the true reality of daily life for the royalty of medieval Europe? How exactly did they spend their hours within the grounds of their expansive estates and fortified manor houses? When they finally reclined their crowned heads for slumber each evening, what visions and anxieties danced behind their noble visages? As your own head settles deeply onto your soft pillow, I encourage you to momentarily step into their richly embroidered shoes. Imagine yourself as a king or queen in the Middle Ages, born into a life of extraordinary privilege and command, yet simultaneously constrained by duty, expectation, and rigorous custom. Every decision you face has a potential to influence not just your own fate, but the very destiny of nations. Therefore, join me now, dear listener, as we tread softly through vast, echoing throne rooms and down dark, torch-illuminated passages. Our footsteps are silenced by the thick layer of rushes scattered across the cold, hard floor. We will listen in on formal consultations and religious rites, grand banquets and lively festivals, bursts of airs and official betrothals. Through this exploration, we might just realize that the monarchs of ancient times were far more human and complex than the dry accounts of history often imply. Our initial point of interest will be the monarch's own sleeping quarters, that most intimate and shielded of sanctuaries where royalty began and concluded every day. As you sink deeper into your own feather-filled sanctuary, let us draw aside the heavy velvet curtains and witness the morning break as they might have done so many centuries ago. Visualize, if you will, the first slivers of sunlight infiltrating a narrow window slit, casting a gleam off the gold threads woven into an elaborately crafted wall hanging. A gently glowing fireplace provides a cozy warmth to the chamber, its dancing light reflecting on the deep, intricate carvings of a colossal oak bed, piled high with fine, stitched cushions and luxurious animal hides. Complete silence reigns, broken only by the steady breathing of the noble occupants within. Soon after, a reserved tapping at the door awakens the royal pair. It is the groom of the stool, the most trusted and close personal attendant, arriving to assist the king with his morning cleansing rituals. With immense formality, the monarch is washed, dried, and dressed, garment upon opulent garment. The queen receives similar attention from her ladies-in-waiting, each a high-born gentlewoman subtly competing for her favor. Religious devotions follow. The king and queen are expected to be an exemplary model of piety for their people. They kneel side by side in a small, private sanctuary to recite the morning prayers, the Latin phrases deeply ingrained in their memory. The rising haze of frankincense and the sparkle of the sacred chalices create an almost ethereal atmosphere, serving as a constant reminder that the right to rule is a sacred privilege. Even the most powerful must show humility before God. Yet, despite all the elaborate ritual, the grandeur, and the prayer, medieval monarchs also had critical worldly responsibilities demanding their focus. Thus, strengthened by their faith, the king and queen would emerge to face a day completely filled with courtly obligations and governmental duties. As we have observed, even with their vast authority and elevated status, medieval monarchs were fundamentally human beings, subject to all the faults, anxieties, and quirks that implies. Their lives were shaped equally by weighty governance and light-hearted entertainment, by religious observance and political maneuvering. Perhaps no ruler better personified these inherent contradictions than the 12th century queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122 into one of France's wealthiest and most influential noble families, the young Eleanor was the heiress to a massive estate that encompassed nearly a third of the country. Strikingly beautiful, highly intelligent, and famously strong-willed, she was considered one of Europe's most desirable unmarried women. In 1137, at the tender age of 15, she married the 17-year-old Prince Louis, heir to the French throne. While this was a socially significant alliance, it was not a joyful one. The intellectual and devout Louis was a poor match for the spirited and worldly Eleanor. Nonetheless, when Louis's father passed away later that year, the teenage pair became King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of France. Despite their personal incompatibility, Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, commanding a contingent of her own soldiers from Aquitaine. This bold and independent action was quite controversial for the period. Crusading was widely considered the exclusive domain of men, not noble women. But Eleanor was far from ordinary. Clad in protective gear and mounted on a white charger, she presented a dramatic figure during the march toward the Holy Land. Regrettably, like most military expeditions of that era, the crusade ended in failure. The Christian forces were unable to recapture Jerusalem and returned home defeated. The experience of the crusade only served to deepen the rift between Eleanor and Louis. They had never been emotionally close, but now they found each other nearly intolerable. After 15 years of marriage and the birth of 2 daughters, the mismatched couple petitioned for an annulment, citing consanguinity, being related by blood, a severe prohibition by the Church. In truth, this was merely a convenient legal pretext to dissolve a miserable union. The Pope granted the annulment in 1152, and at the age of 30, Eleanor suddenly found herself both single and immensely powerful. She did not remain unattached for long. Just 2 months after the annulment, Eleanor married the robust young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, an 18-year-old named Henry Plantagenet. It was a rapid courtship and a highly astute political maneuver. Through their marriage, Eleanor's vast ancestral lands were combined with Henry's territories, creating a formidable balance of power against the French crown. But that was merely the beginning. When Henry's cousin, King Stephen of England, died in 1154, Henry presses claim to the English throne, becoming King Henry II with Eleanor as his queen. Instantly, the couple governed an expansive realm that stretched from the borders of Scotland all the way to the Pyrenees, a territory known as the Angevin Empire. Over the subsequent 13 years, the extremely fertile Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including the future monarchs Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland of Magna Carta fame. However, their royal union was not one of constant harmony. Similar to Eleanor's first marriage, her second was defined by serious friction and open conflict. Henry was a notorious womanizer, openly taking paramours and fathering children out of wedlock. Furthermore, he was an overbearing and frequently harsh husband, restricting Eleanor's movements and significantly limiting her political authority. The fiercely independent Eleanor resented this subjugation, and the marriage rapidly degraded into a state of cold, political warfare. The situation reached a crisis point in 1173 when Eleanor's sons, urged on by their mother, rebelled against King Henry in a direct challenge for greater power. It was the ultimate dynastic act of disloyalty, but the uprising was quickly suppressed, and Henry exacted his retribution. He had Eleanor captured and imprisoned her for the next 16 years, keeping her confined in various royal strongholds. Her sons fared little better. Henry's namesake, the young King Henry, died of dysentery while leading a subsequent revolt in 1183. Geoffrey tragically perished in a jousting competition in 1186. But time and fate are relentless, even for kings. When Henry II himself died in 1189, Eleanor's preferred son, Richard, ascended to the throne, and one of his very first royal acts was to secure the release of his long-suffering mother. At the respectable age of 67, Eleanor rode out of her long captivity and immediately returned to the center of political power. With Richard frequently absent on crusade, Eleanor effectively served as regent for her son, expertly managing the entire kingdom, and even arranging his massive ransom when he was temporarily held captive. Even in her later years, the unyielding Eleanor remained a commanding political player. When Richard died in 1199, she supported her youngest son, John's claim to the crown over that of his nephew, Arthur. At the age of 77, she personally led an army to besiege Arthur's loyalists, successfully securing the royal succession for John. She passed away in 1204 at the Abbey of Fontevraud at the truly remarkable age of 82, an astonishing lifespan for the medieval period. In numerous ways, Eleanor of Aquitaine simultaneously reflected and defied the established roles for medieval queens. She wielded enormous wealth and influence, shaping the political landscape of her century through her strategic marriages and her children's powerful positions. However, she also endured profound hardships, from an abusive spouse to a 16-year incarceration. She was a woman who completely broke the standard mold, refusing to be confined by the restrictive expectations of her gender or social rank. A trendsetter and a pioneer, a crusader and a queen, a mother and a monarch, Eleanor's extraordinary life story reads like something extracted from an epic literary work. Yet, her narrative is factual, a compelling testament to the intricate realities of life for medieval royalty. The power and the prestige, the duty and the personal life, the piety and the statecraft, all were integral components of the royal existence. Eleanor embodied these inherent contradictions perhaps more thoroughly than any other figure, navigating them with astuteness and sheer perseverance. Her legacy continues to resonate, captivating the attention of historians and writers alike. As we continue to explore the lives of other noteworthy monarchs alongside Eleanor, a rich, multifaceted tapestry of medieval monarchy comes into view. This was a world of decadent feasts and strict religious fasts, of enormous castles and stunningly grand cathedrals, of politically arranged unions and stylized courtly romances. It was a world where reputation was everything and dynasty was paramount, where the crown represented both a blessing and a heavy burden. In summary, it was a world at once strangely remote and yet strikingly familiar to our own. Perhaps this is precisely why exploring the private lives of medieval kings and queens remains so fascinating to us. It provides an intimate window into a vanished era, a chance to observe the humanity hidden beneath the symbols of rank. In their victories and their defeats, their flaws and their merits, we find reflections of our own timeless struggles. In this sense, their ancient stories truly become a part of our own shared history. So, as we bring our journey through the exclusive domain of medieval royalty to a close for the moment, let us pause to consider the timeless lessons their lives offer us, the dangers inherent in absolute power, the burdens that come with privilege, the sheer weight of public expectation, but also the enduring human capacity for resilience, for radical self-reinvention, and for leaving a profound imprint on history. For ultimately, though they wore crowns and presided over kingdoms, they were still mortal and fallible, made of flesh and blood, just like you and me. And on that contemplative note, dear listener, it is time for us to bid farewell to the gilded royal courts and the softly illuminated halls of ages past. May your sleep be filled with pleasant visions of magnificent strongholds and noble ladies, of brave warriors and sagacious rulers. And may you wake up feeling completely refreshed, with a renewed appreciation for monarchy of old and the universal humanity that binds us all. Until our next historical foray, I wish you good night and the sweetest of dreams. The establishment of the Order of the Garter by Edward III set an entirely new benchmark for the ceremonial and chivalric principles that would come to define royal life throughout the late Middle Ages. This prestigious association of knights, with its elaborate induction ceremonies, sumptuous banquets, and the recognizable emblem of a blue garter, perfectly symbolized the pageantry and majesty that medieval sovereigns aimed to project. As we have seen, Edward and his queen, Philippa, presided over a truly splendid court culture at Windsor Castle, surrounding themselves with the most acclaimed artists, poets, and musicians of the time. However, amidst all this grandeur and festive display, medieval rulers were also strictly expected to embody a deep and unwavering piety. Religion permeated every single facet of life during the Middle Ages. This was particularly true for monarchs, who governed by divine right. A king or queen was regarded as God's designated representative on earth, entrusted with guiding their people not only in matters of governance, but in spiritual affairs as well. Consequently, medieval royalty were held to the absolute highest standards of moral rectitude and profound religious devotion. A typical day for a medieval monarch would commence with morning mass in their opulent private chapel, attended by a full retinue of priests and clerics. Kings and queens would dedicate long stretches of time to prayer, offering supplications for the prosperity of their kingdom and the salvation of their own eternal soul. The Book of Hours, a beautifully decorated devotional manuscript, was a cherished personal possession for many royals, who would study its gilded pages in quiet reflection. The liturgical calendar also heavily influenced the rhythm of courtly life. The religious year was punctuated by a defined series of holy celebrations and compulsory fasts that all members of the royal household were required to observe. Lent, in particular, involved restricting the royal diet to very simple, meatless meals, symbolically mirroring Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. Yet, it was during the major observances of Christmas and Easter that the devotion and majesty of medieval monarchy reached their most magnificent expression. The king or queen will preside over truly spectacular ceremonies in the great cathedrals, dressed in their finest regalia and crowns. Surrounded by swirling clouds of incense and the solemn chants of large choirs, they would take Holy Communion before their assembled subjects, unequivocally reaffirming their role as the ultimate spiritual authority in the kingdom. This public demonstration of faith was immensely important for fostering the aura of sanctity and righteousness upon which medieval rulers relied to legitimize their temporal authority. By publicly revering saintly artifacts, funding monasteries and churches, and even embarking on difficult holy pilgrimages and crusades, kings and queens consistently reinforced their image as the godly protectors of Christian society. Perhaps no one personified this ideal of the devout medieval monarch more completely than Louis IX of France, historically known as St. Louis. Renowned for his deep personal faith and austere lifestyle, Louis was a king who practiced regular fasting, wore a coarse hair shirt beneath his royal robes as an act of penance, and even welcomed the poor to dine at his own table. He led 2 ultimately unsuccessful crusades to the Holy Land, tragically dying of dysentery on the second expedition in Tunisia. However, his reputation for saintliness only intensified, and he was formally canonized by the Catholic Church just 27 years following his death. Naturally, not all medieval rulers successfully lived up to such exalted standards. For every St. Louis, there was a figure like Henry VIII of England, who famously initiated a complete split with the Catholic Church in order to secure a divorce from his first wife, going on to marry 5 more times. Similarly, the infamous Pope Alexander VI, who reigned during the Renaissance, openly acknowledged his children born out of wedlock and was accused of turning the Vatican into a center of moral decay. However, for the majority of medieval monarchs, piety and prayer remain an utterly essential element of both their daily routines and their public image. In an age where the distinction between the sacred and the secular was very narrow indeed, kings and queens were expected to bridge that divide, serving as both the temporal and spiritual leaders of their population. This was a tremendous responsibility, one that could take a significant toll even on the most devout rulers. The great Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne, who governed much of Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, was said to have wept with emotion as he received communion on his deathbed. He felt so intensely the burden of his personal sins and the sheer immensity of his role as God's vice-regent on earth. For the medieval monarchs who bore the sacred mantle, the glittering accoutrements of royal life, the elaborate feasts, the silk-draped beds, the fawning courtiers, were perhaps a welcome diversion from profound matters of the soul that preoccupied so many of their waking moments. In the flickering candlelight of the royal chapel, as the king or queen knelt in supplication before the altar, the outside world, with its earthly concerns and pleasures, must have seemed distant indeed. As we contemplate these ancient rulers in their private moments of devotion, we are reminded of the deeply human dimension of even the most elevated lives. Behind the crowns and scepters, the ermine-trimmed robes, and the soaring rhetoric, medieval monarchs wrestle with the same eternal human questions. Questions of life's true meaning of mortality and of the deep yearning for a connection to the divine. In the tomb-like silence of the great cathedrals where they prayed, or in the moving shadows of their own bedchambers, these kings and queens sought comfort and guidance from a higher authority. In doing so, they left us a powerful testament to the enduring search for purpose and transcendence that unites all humanity across the ages. Yet, even the most pious of rulers could not spend their entire lives in prayer and contemplation. The immediate business of actually governing a kingdom demanded their attention, and medieval monarchs had to skillfully navigate a treacherous landscape of conflicting interests, shifting alliances, and powerful noble figures as they sought to maintain their grasp on authority. Perhaps no one figure exemplified the necessary shrewd political maneuvering and sheer force of character required of a successful medieval ruler, quite like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into a wealthy noble family in southwestern France in 1122, Eleanor was one of Europe's most eligible women when she inherited the massive Duchy of Aquitaine in her own name at the young age of 15. Her first marriage to the pious King Louis VII of France was, by all accounts, a clash of temperaments. The sophisticated and well-traveled Eleanor found the ascetic Louis unbearably boring, and their relationship soured significantly after she joined him on the ill-fated Second Crusade to the Holy Land. The expedition was a categorical disaster, and rumors circulated that Eleanor had been involved in an affair with her uncle, the charismatic Raymond of Poitiers, while encamped near the mighty walls of Antioch. When the royal couple finally returned to France, their marriage was effectively over. In a shocking development for the time, the Pope granted Louis an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related. Eleanor, still only 28 years old, instantly found herself once again the most coveted bride in all of Christendom. Her next marriage would prove far more impactful. Just 8 weeks following her annulment, Eleanor married the young Duke of Normandy, who also held vast territories in western France. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and 2 years later, he would ascend to the throne of England as King Henry II, with Eleanor by his side as queen. Together, Eleanor and Henry would preside over a sprawling, powerful empire that stretched from the Scottish borders down to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England and more than half of modern-day France. It was one of the largest and most potent realms in medieval Europe, and at its heart stood the formidable, albeit tempestuous, partnership of Henry and Eleanor. Over the course of their tumultuous 35-year marriage, the royal couple would have 8 children together, including the 2 future kings of England, the famous Richard the Lionheart and his notoriously treacherous brother, John. Eleanor would later serve as regent for her sons when they took the throne, wielding immense political power and influence in her own capacity. However, her journey to becoming one of the most powerful women in the medieval world was certainly not a smooth one. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was famous for its internal strife, marked by Henry's infidelities, constant power struggles, and outright rebellion from their sons, often encouraged by Eleanor herself. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 eldest sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, launched a revolt against their father in a bid for greater autonomy and control over their own lands. Eleanor, who had long felt restrained by Henry's attempts to curb her authority, decisively sided with her sons in the uprising, but the rebellion was ultimately crushed, and Eleanor was captured while attempting to escape to France. An enraged Henry promptly imprisoned her, holding his queen under house arrest for the following 16 years. It was only after Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her son Richard, now King of England. Despite being nearly 70 years old, she wasted no time in reasserting her political influence. When Richard set off on the Third Crusade shortly after his coronation, Eleanor expertly served as regent in his absence, governing England with a firm, capable hand. She went on to outlive both Richard and his successor, John, eventually dying in 1204 at the remarkable age of 82. Eleanor's long and exceptionally tumultuous life offers a compelling insight into the complex realities of both power and gender in the medieval world. As a woman who commanded enormous influence in her own right, as a wealthy heiress, queen consort, regent, and the mother of kings, Eleanor directly challenged many of the constraints placed upon her sex in a deeply patriarchal society. Yet, her story also tragically highlights the precariousness of even the most elevated woman's status in that era. Despite all her wealth and influence, Eleanor was still ultimately subjected to the will of the dominant men around her. And yet, Eleanor's lasting appeal for academics and chroniclers alike suggests that her significance vastly surpasses the simple emblems of royalty or the restrictions of her sex. In many respects, she embodies the driven, seeking spirit of her time, an age when a long-standing feudal system was beginning to give way to a new cultural landscape defined by refined courtly romance, the principles of chivalry, and the very first stirrings of self-awareness and individualism. As an enthusiastic patron of the arts and a prominent figure in the courts of love, grand gatherings where the elaborate rules of romantic courtship were discussed and formalized, Eleanor played a crucial role in shaping the cultural ideals that would characterize the High Middle Ages. Her pervasive influence can be detected everywhere, from the lyrical verse of the troubadours to the magnificent skyscraping cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts that still inspire awe today. Within Eleanor's history, we observe a woman who actively wrestled with the major dilemmas of her generation. Questions concerning power, spiritual belief, human affection, and personal responsibility. She left a permanent, powerful impression on the world she inhabited. Her life is a story filled with ambition and political maneuvering, intense emotion and high-stakes statecraft, and the constant effort to assert one's identity in a society that was often unwelcoming to determined, strong-minded women. Ultimately, however, it is a deeply human narrative. It serves as a potent reminder that even the most colossal figures of history were simply people of flesh and blood, possessing all the vulnerabilities and imperfections common to mankind. In the shimmering low light of a castle chamber from long ago, we can picture Eleanor in a rare moment of relaxation, a woman of unyielding spirit and sharp intellect, yet still subject to the same fundamental hopes and weaknesses that have always motivated the human heart. As our minds drift towards slumber, let us dream of Eleanor and her fascinating epic, a world of crenellated fortress walls and vibrant, snapping banners, of majestic, vaulted cathedrals and fragrant gardens, a place where love and conflict and the eternal struggle for authority unfolded. Let us also remember that the grand, sweeping narrative of history is ultimately constructed from the countless, intertwined threads of individual lives. Every one of them is a personal story awaiting its retelling, a legacy yearning to be acknowledged in profound stillness of the night. As we've established, the lives of medieval royalty were drenched in opulence and ceremony, yet simultaneously heavily restricted by inflexible expectations and overwhelming duties. Despite the undeniable splendor of their palaces and retinues, the daily existence of kings and queens was, in many ways, far from desirable. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine once more. Born into great wealth as the heiress to a vast duchy, she became Queen of France at the young age of 15 upon her marriage to King Louis VII. The youthful couple embarked on the disastrous Second Crusade together, a grueling, multi-thousand-mile expedition that resulted in military failure and their personal estrangement. After 15 years and 2 daughters, Eleanor and Louis's marriage was dissolved based on a claim of shared ancestry. But Eleanor's chapter was far from closed. Just 2 months later, she married the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who soon after ascended as King Henry II of England. As queen again, Eleanor demonstrated herself to be a formidable political operator, governing England as regent during Henry's frequent absences and giving birth to 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Yet, despite her personal power, Eleanor's life was volatile and frequently curtailed by the political realities of the day. Her marriage to Henry became increasingly hostile, and her ultimate encouragement of her sons to rebel against their father, a severe transgression, led to her spending 16 years confined under house arrest. She ultimately outlived both her husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children, reaching the impressive age of 82 as the Queen Mother and one of the era's great survivors. Eleanor's remarkable narrative emphasizes the precarious situation in which even the most high-ranking medieval women found themselves. Subject to the ultimate authority of their fathers, husbands, and sons, queens could exert significant influence from behind the scenes, but this was always done at the risk of official condemnation or harsh penalty for exceeding their prescribed limits. The personal sphere was profoundly political. A royal woman's selection of a husband or her ability to successfully produce male heirs could determine the difference between dynastic triumph and catastrophic failure. This political reality was tragically evident in the life of Empress Matilda, the daughter of King Henry I of England. Prepared for leadership from childhood, Matilda was first married to the Holy Roman Emperor as a young teenager, and later brought back to England to be named her father's successor after the unfortunate death of her brother in a shipwreck. However, the powerful barons balked at accepting a female ruler. When Henry I died, Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, swiftly moved to seize the throne, throwing England into a nearly 20-year civil conflict known to history as the Anarchy. Matilda fought relentlessly for what she believed was her legitimate birthright, gathering armies and even escaping a besieged castle by being lowered down the walls within a shroud-like coffin. She came incredibly close to achieving the crown, entering London victorious and preparing for her coronation. But the unpredictable populace quickly turned against her, driving her out of the city, never to return as sovereign. Ultimately, Matilda was compelled to accept a compromise, seeing her son, the future Henry II, officially recognized as Stephen's successor. This was a diplomatic resolution that ended England's turmoil, but represented a deep personal disappointment for a woman who had struggled so long and hard to rule in her own capacity. The biographies of Eleanor and Matilda offer a poignant testament to the limitations faced by medieval women, even those at the pinnacle of society. Queens and empresses could accumulate vast wealth and wield considerable influence, but their true agency was always dependent on the tolerance of the men surrounding them. In an age where military capability was a definitive source of authority, female rulers could only ever be regents or temporary intercessors, never truly secure in their personal command. Yet, if the overt political arena was often closed off to them, medieval royal women effectively found other channels for their ambitions. Many carved out significant roles for themselves as cultural patrons, commissioning spectacular works of art and grand architecture to adorn their residences and immortalize their names. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was a famous sponsor of troubadours and poets, overseeing a vibrant court culture that was instrumental in establishing the early medieval trend of courtly love. Other queens took a more active role in the religious life of their realms, establishing abbeys and monasteries, undertaking pilgrimages, and even leading military expeditions in God's name, as Eleanor did alongside her first husband. The church offered a rare domain where royal women could exercise a measure of personal autonomy and spiritual authority, even though the same church often relegated them to a subordinate position in the general social hierarchy. Of course, not all medieval monarchs were such larger-than-life personalities as Eleanor or Matilda. For every ruler who left a lasting, visible mark on the historical record, there were scores more who lived and died in relative obscurity, their names recorded only in dry official registers and forgotten genealogies. These overlooked sovereigns may not have dramatically altered the course of nations, but their experiences are also crucial for understanding what life was truly like for royalty in an age so distant from our own. Consider, for instance, the daily routine of an average medieval king. While we might imagine modern royal schedules to be constantly filled with court ceremonials, diplomatic meetings, and pressing affairs of state, the reality in medieval times was often considerably more languid. While the typical day would commence with Mass at dawn, followed perhaps by the dispensation of justice or audiences with courtiers, many monarchs spent long periods in leisurely ease, drifting from elaborate banquet to a spirited hunt to the gaming table in a haze of continuous pleasure-seeking. Writing in the 12th century, the chronicler Walter Map described a royal feast with more than a hint of moralistic disapproval. In the midst of unrestrained delights and unbridled gratification, with jesters and singers, with delicacies and dishes fit for kings, dancers, and acrobats, all propriety was discarded, all modesty abandoned, and day was inverted into night by the flaring of torches, and the air rang with shouts and loud acclamations. Beneath the superficial bravado of such indulgence, one could discern a very human vulnerability. For all their freedom to enjoy feasts and frivolities, medieval monarchs were simultaneously expected to live up to nearly impossible ideals of nobility, deep piety, and strict honor. They were required to be generous benefactors, formidable warriors, wise judicial authorities, and morally unimpeachable examples, all while successfully navigating the treacherous currents of court politics and dynastic rivalry. It is hardly surprising that so many sought fleeting relief in life's brief pleasures or clung tightly to the solace of religion. At the close of the day, perhaps the most striking aspect of the medieval monarchical experience is not its distance from our own, but its fundamental human connection. Peeling back the luxurious ermine robes and the shining crowns, one discovers people who are not so different from ourselves. Individuals struggling to reconcile responsibility and personal desire, aiming to make their mark in the world, while playing the difficult hand dealt to them by fate and circumstance. In a society as strictly hierarchical as medieval Europe, it might be tempting to view royalty as superhuman models, inherently blessed by birthright to float far above the common realm of worries and suffering. But a closer examination of their lives reveals a different image, one of real men and women shouldering heavy responsibilities and quietly harboring personal dreams, much like any of us today. So, the next time you settle in for the night and close your heavy eyes, spare a thought for those long-ago kings and queens whose stories have descended to us through the ages. Imagine yourself behind the high stone walls of a drafty castle bedchamber, feeling the sheer weight of the crown as your head sinks into the pillow. Dream yourself into their world of rigid ceremony and high intrigue, of boredom and fervent longing, and consider for a moment how much has changed and, critically, how much remains the same. As we've observed, the lives of medieval monarchs were shaped by immense responsibilities and grand public displays of power. But perhaps no ruler better exemplified the precarious nature of royal authority, quite like the 12th century Empress Matilda. Born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and Matilda of Scotland, the young princess received a privileged upbringing befitting her high status. She was married at just 8 years old to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in a lavish ceremony that cemented a crucial political alliance. At the imperial court in Germany, Matilda flourished. She quickly adapted to the language and customs of her new home, impressing those around her with her composure and intellect. The teenage empress traveled extensively with her husband, even joining him on military expeditions in Italy. Sadly, Henry V died suddenly of illness in 1125, leaving the 23-year-old Matilda a widow. With no children of her own from that marriage, she returned to the English court of her father. King Henry I doted on his only surviving legitimate child. He formally named Matilda as his heir and compelled his barons to swear loyalty to her, an unprecedented move, as a woman had never ruled England in her own right before. To solidify her claim, Henry arranged Matilda's marriage to the powerful Geoffrey of Anjou in 1128. The union produced 3 sons, including the future King Henry II. However, political storm clouds were gathering. Many of England's barons deeply resented the concept of a female sovereign, and Matilda's proud, haughty demeanor at court did little to win over would-be subjects. When Henry I died in 1135, the scene was set for a dramatic conflict over the royal succession. The king's nephew, Stephen of Blois, swiftly crossed the channel, seized a crown for himself, and was quickly recognized as ruler by the English church. Matilda was outraged. Alongside her husband Geoffrey, she rallied supporters to her cause and launched an invasion of England in 1139. The inherent perils of the monarchical life were brutally exposed as a bitter civil war erupted. For over a decade, the realm was consumed by bloody conflict and rapidly shifting alliances as Matilda battled her cousin Stephen for the throne. The period became tragically known as the Anarchy. Despite her sheer tenacity, the Empress struggled to secure a decisive victory. Her forces captured Stephen in battle in 1141, and Matilda briefly assumed control of the government. But a series of strategic errors and her imperious rule alienated crucial allies. A popular uprising quickly drove Matilda out of London just before her planned coronation. As the war dragged on, the populace suffered immensely from the complete breakdown in law and order. In the end, neither Matilda nor Stephen truly prevailed. The anarchy concluded in 1153 with the Treaty of Winchester, which permitted Stephen to retain the throne, but officially designated Matilda's young son, Henry, as a successor. The following year, Stephen's death cleared the path for Henry II to finally restore stability to England. Matilda's decades-long fight to secure her royal inheritance was over. The dramatic life story of the Empress Matilda vividly illustrates a reality that even the most privileged royal existence could be violently disrupted by political upheaval. Matilda was born into authority and prepared for greatness, but her sex and her strong, unbending personality ultimately obstructed her path to the crown. While she never ruled in her own name, Matilda's lifelong dedication to securing the throne laid the bedrock for the Plantagenet dynasty that would dominate England for over 300 years. Throughout the Middle Ages, monarchs like Matilda were expected to serve as guiding lights of culture and learning for their subjects. In an era when access to education was largely restricted to wealthy and religious orders, medieval royalty played a disproportionately large role in fostering the arts and sciences. Kings and queens would utilize their vast resources as patrons, supporting the work of scholars and artisans in a grand demonstration of power and prestige. Few actions showcase the cultural clout of a ruler more effectively than commissioning magnificent works of architecture. Soaring cathedrals and imposing castles serve as awe-inspiring tributes to both God and the king. The Gothic style that flourished in the 12th to the 16th centuries was characterized by its pointed arches, external flying buttresses, intricate sculptural details, and luminous stained glass, all technical marvels requiring massive teams of skilled masons, glassworkers, and craftsmen to build. Take the iconic example of Chartres Cathedral in France. The majority of this stunning church was erected between 1194 and 1250 during the reigns of Philip II, Louis VIII, and Louis IX. Its towering 112-foot stone-vaulted ceiling, 176 stained glass windows, and ornate royal portal were all cutting-edge innovations for the period. As many as 300 artisans may have labored continuously over decades to complete this Gothic masterpiece. Naturally, no less impressive were the projects monarchs commissioned for their own official residences. Sprawling palaces and fortified castles were built and expanded over centuries, with each new generation of rulers adding their own personal artistic touches. The famed Palace of Westminster in London began as a simple 11th century dwelling for Anglo-Saxon kings. But by the time Richard II began rebuilding it in 1394, the palace featured a magnificent great hall, separate royal apartments, and defensive walls enclosing over 10 acres along the River Thames. Inside their stately homes, medieval monarchs surrounded themselves with beauty. Tapestries were the ultimate status symbol, incredibly expensive to create. They provided warmth, color, and narrative storytelling to drafty stone halls. Monarchs from Charlemagne to Henry VIII amassed immense collections of ornate tapestries, such as the 14th century Apocalypse series, which stretched 472 feet in length. Illuminated manuscripts, wall paintings, frescoes, silk cushions, and silver tableware completed the sumptuous interior design. But royal patronage extended far beyond the visual arts. Poets, playwrights, and musicians could achieve fame and fortune within the orb of the court. Rulers sponsored extravagant performances and competitions and hired the most renowned creators of the day as official court composers. One can trace the evolution of secular music through luminaries like Guillaume de Machaut, who served John the Blind, King of Bohemia, in the 1300s. Perhaps one of the most enduring forms of cultural support practiced by medieval monarchs was the founding of universities and libraries. From the 1100s onward, a ruler's prestige became intrinsically linked to the number of scholars they could attract and the educational institutions they could establish. The universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne all benefited from royal patrons. Vast book collections amassed in places like the Library of the Louvre made Paris a leading capital of learning. By supporting the wide dissemination of knowledge, monarchs hoped to simultaneously glorify God and enhance their own reputations. Of course, not all cultural projects were so high-minded. Entertaining the court was a major preoccupation, and some rulers gained notoriety for their lavish festivities that extended for days. One particularly infamous example was the so-called Ball d'Ardence, or Ball of the Burning Men, held by the French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria in 1393. For this wild masquerade, King Charles VI and several lords disguised themselves as wild men in costumes made of linen soaked with resin for a hairy effect. When the king's brother approached with a torch, the highly flammable outfits instantly caught fire. Several men were burned alive, though the king was saved by the quick thinking of his young aunt. This gruesome incident was widely considered an ill omen, tragically foreshadowing Charles VI's later debilitating bouts of madness. Tragedies aside, the cultural legacy left by medieval royalty is undeniable. The period marked a great blossoming of creativity and learning, with rulers leading the way as patrons by commissioning magnificent buildings, art, and institutions of knowledge. Kings and queens hoped to achieve a form of immortality beyond their own reigns. And for us modern observers, peering back through the centuries, these tangible remnants of royal lives help bring a long-ago era into vivid, focused reality. While it is tempting to romanticize the pageantry and immense luxury of medieval royalty, the day-to-day existence for even the most powerful rulers was often significantly constrained. The famous saying, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown," perfectly encapsulates the suffocating pressure and profound isolation that could characterize life at the very top of the social hierarchy. Even for anointed monarchs, there was remarkably little privacy or personal freedom. A royal's daily life revolved entirely around ritual, with each hour dictated by religious services, official ceremonies, court functions, and scheduled leisure activities. Every single action was governed by strict protocol and rigid etiquette, from how low-ranking servants could approach them to which specific dishes could be served at a banquet. A vast, sprawling entourage of attendants, courtiers, and guardsmen, a king or queen was rarely, if ever, truly alone. Consider the claustrophobic conditions of King Charles VI of France, who reigned from 1380 to 1422. From childhood, Charles was monitored constantly. His tutors and mentors tracked his every move and conversation. As an adult, he actually had to submit a formal petition to the royal council for permission just to visit his wife in another castle. His eventual descent into severe madness only intensified the network of supervision surrounding him. Though sovereigns theoretically wielded vast, absolute power, they were frequently constrained in practice by complex webs of tradition and aristocratic influence. Running a kingdom required constantly keeping landed nobles content, which meant granting them the right offices, advantageous marriages, and honors at court. Before the development of professional bureaucracies, kings were utterly dependent on their great magnates to carry out everything from collecting taxes to raising armies, giving those nobles immense leverage. Those monarchs who failed to placate their aristocratic subjects could face dire consequences. The Barons' Wars in 13th century England saw King Henry III effectively taken hostage by a rebellious confederation of lords after they felt he had violated their ancient rights and privileges. Henry was forced to accept reforms that severely limited royal authority and granted more power to a council of nobles. The crown's inherent dependence on the goodwill of the aristocracy was laid bare. The most intimate aspects of a ruler's life were also dictated by politics. Marriages, particularly for women, were almost always arranged with diplomatic objectives in mind. Kings and queens were viewed as valuable pieces on the dynastic chessboard, used to seal alliances or territorial claims. The personal wishes of the betrothed were rarely, if ever, a factor. Princes and princesses often met their future spouses for the very first time at the altar. Once wed, a royal couple's foremost duty was to produce heirs to ensure the continuation of the dynasty. This pressure was especially intense for women, whose worth was frequently measured by their fertility. The 15th century Margaret of Anjou endured 7 years of marriage to King Henry VI without conceiving before finally giving birth to a son, Edward. But when the long-awaited prince was disinherited amidst the Wars of the Roses, Margaret transformed into a fierce warrior queen, personally leading armies into battle on his behalf. Of course, not all royal marriages were purely cold political alliances. The great love story of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile in the 1200s is recorded in openly affectionate letters that capture their genuine mutual devotion. And the 14th century saw the devotion between Edward II and his friend Piers Gaveston, who share an emotional and perhaps romantic bond. Yet, even these personal relationships unfolded on a public stage, constantly subject to the scrutiny and judgment of the courtiers. Despite the immense privilege of their rank, royalty sacrificed much of their personal autonomy. The crown's isolation also enforced a formal distance from their own subjects. Rare glimpses behind the meticulously controlled public facade, like Henry VI's melancholic mental breakdowns or Edward II's raw grief over Gaveston's death, reminded the realm of their ruler's humanity. But more often, what the public saw and what history records is the public persona of an exalted but inaccessible figure. In the end, perhaps the greatest constraint on a medieval monarch was the unrelenting pressure to live up to the lofty, almost impossible ideals of the role. Kings were expected to be paragons of justice, fount of honor, and steadfast defenders of the church. Queens were meant to be models of beauty, virtue, and piety. They had to project an image that was strong yet merciful, dignified yet generous. And through their patronage and their conquests, they were tasked with building a worthy and enduring legacy for the ages. Imagine the sheer weight of these expectations on even the most high-born shoulders. Peering back through the mist of time, one almost sees the glittering mask of royalty slip aside, revealing the all-too-human faces beneath the crowns. The bejeweled robes and heralded banners cannot fully conceal the cares and passions of people who were fundamentally like any other. People who experience laughter, tears, and rage between the grand ceremonies and the stately portraits. As the velvet curtains of history close on the spectacular pageant of medieval royalty, perhaps this is what resonates most profoundly in our imagination. Not just the majestic castles and the opulent treasures, but the individual men and women who bore the lonely burden of rule. While monarchs' lives were in many ways impossibly distant from our own, to empathize with them across the ages is to sense an inner world that was achingly familiar, whether crowned or common. Good night, and may your dreams be graced by the gilded shadows of yesteryear, the regal phantoms who, for all their legendary deeds and outsized renown, were still human souls, much like you or I. Rest now and ponder what life was truly like for those who reigned so long ago in an era lost to antiquity, but not beyond our imagining. Until next time, fare thee well, my royal dreamer. A princess received instruction in domestic accomplishments like fine needlework, alongside dancing, music, and the essential social graces. Education for the princes was considerably more extensive, encompassing military instruction as well as academic disciplines such as languages, mathematics, legal studies, and history. All royal children were thoroughly educated in theology and courtly manners. However, perhaps the most critical lessons they learned concerned dynastic statecraft. From their earliest years, royal offspring understood that their marriages would be meticulously arranged for purely political purposes, to solidify alliances or bring wealthy territories under the family's direct control. Personal romantic fulfillment was a luxury that royalty could rarely afford. Some royal children were formally betrothed while still infants. Their individual contentment was a minor consideration compared to the overall welfare of the realm. A famous example of a childhood engagement that profoundly influenced history was that of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor was the elder daughter of William, Duke of Aquitaine, who governed the largest and wealthiest province in what is now modern France. The spirited and strong-willed Eleanor became his heiress and was fiercely sought after as a bride. She married the future King Louis VII of France when she was only about 15 years old. Beautiful, immensely wealthy, and possessing a powerful personality, Eleanor was not content to be a simple, submissive queen consort. When her devout husband Louis joined the Second Crusade in 1147 to campaign in the Holy Land, Eleanor scandalized many by staunchly insisting on accompanying him. Attended by hundreds of her ladies, the queen set out with great flair, even wearing armor and carrying a lance. But the crusade proved disastrous for the French forces, and the marriage between Louis and Eleanor became irreparably strained, largely because she had failed to produce a male successor. Matters reached a head upon their return, and Eleanor requested an annulment on the technical grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related. The embarrassed Louis consented, and their marriage was legally dissolved in 1152, leaving Eleanor single and once again in possession of her vast inheritance from Aquitaine. Being a great heiress made Eleanor the most desirable prize on the medieval marriage market. She soon married a dynamic young nobleman named Henry, who 2 years later would ascend to the throne of England as Henry II. With him, Eleanor bore 8 children, including 5 sons, 2 of whom would become kings in their turn. But as Eleanor matured, her relationship with the explosive and philandering Henry rapidly deteriorated. After Eleanor actively supported a rebellion by their sons against Henry, the furious king had the queen placed under strict house arrest, where she was held for over a decade. In the very first year of her confinement, 1173, Eleanor's eldest surviving son, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, again revolted against his father, Henry. Richard, his mother's favorite son, may have been encouraged by the knowledge that Eleanor supported his claim. He entered the conflict alongside his younger brother Geoffrey. At one point, the sons actually succeeded in capturing their own father. However, Henry eventually subdued the rebellion, only agreeing to release Eleanor after Richard fully submitted and begged for mercy. Throughout her long period of imprisonment, Eleanor maintained a strong, influential presence over her sons, fueling their ambitious drives and offering guidance through a constant stream of letters. When Henry II finally died in 1189, Richard ascended the throne, and his first official act as king was to order his cherished mother released. Upon Richard's departure for the Third Crusade, he formally appointed Eleanor as Regent of England, allowing her to openly wield supreme power for the first time in her life. As regent, and during Richard's extensive absences and subsequent captivity abroad, Eleanor worked tirelessly to organize his massive ransom fund, negotiate with the Pope on his behalf, and help govern his widespread territories, traveling relentlessly across England and France. The indomitable Eleanor lived the truly remarkable age of 82, spending her final years in her favorite abbey, Fontevraud. Eleanor remains a shining example of how a medieval queen could establish a significant sphere of influence despite the considerable constraints placed upon women in her era. She deliberately cultivated an image of herself as a sophisticated patron of culture and the arts. Indeed, the tradition of courtly love poetry flourished at her court, where Eleanor encouraged troubadours to compose verses extolling the virtues and grace of noble ladies. But Eleanor was an exception in many ways. For the majority of medieval queens, their single most important duty was to provide the king with male heirs. Sons were overwhelmingly preferred over daughters to inherit the throne and perpetuate the family dynasty. Bearing healthy children was such a critical queenly role that infertile queens were frequently discarded. Their barrenness was often viewed as a curse or a judgment delivered by God. The immense pressure on queens to procreate meant that many royal women were almost constantly engaged in a draining cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery for most of their fertile years. Yet, they were simultaneously expected to preside gracefully over court festivities, even when in a delicate condition. And, of course, the inherent dangers of childbirth itself were a recurring menace that tragically claimed the lives of many royal mothers and infants. This tragic reality was exemplified by Queen Philippa of Hainaut, wife of King Edward III of England. Philippa was a devoted consort who provided Edward with a large family, including 5 sons who reached adulthood. She successfully held the reins of government as regent for Edward during his lengthy military campaigns overseas. Beloved for her profound kindness and piety, Philippa was the ideal medieval queen. But the physical toll of bearing so many royal children ultimately cost Philippa her life. She died at age 55 in August 1369, days after giving birth to her 14th child. Edward was completely devastated by the loss of his queen, and she was deeply mourned by her people. Her grandson would one day inherit the throne as the ill-fated Richard II, while sons were most coveted royal offspring. A medieval king also hoped for at least one daughter, who could be married off to a rival ruler to formally seal a peace treaty or secure a vital alliance. Daughters served as useful dynastic bargaining chips in the never-ending game of feudal realpolitik. The marriage contract of a princess was often painfully negotiated through months of tense discussions, with every single clause and condition meticulously detailed. Her dowry was a subject of fierce haggling. Once wed, She was expected to loyally promote her birth family's interests in her new land. Queens who failed in this risked being branded as traitors or worse. Most royal daughters, knowing no alternative way of life, accepted their fate stoically, fulfilling their dynastic obligation. A few long-suffering wives even grew to genuinely care for their husbands, but many others led isolated and unhappy lives in a foreign court far from home, valued primarily for their wedding dowry and their reproductive capability. For a royal bride, whether negotiating her betrothal or navigating the treacherous intrigues of a new court, the best ally she could find was often her own mother. Queens worked tirelessly to advance the marriages of their children, calling in favors, smoothing over interpersonal conflicts, and actively plotting against rivals. Once a queen's daughter was safely delivered to her husband, the mother strived to keep up a regular and detailed correspondence, sending letters filled with personal news, practical advice, and vital warnings. A royal mother's counsel was often her daughter's single greatest asset as she tried to establish herself in an unfamiliar court. This special bond between queens and princesses was one of the most important, albeit frequently strained, relationships in the medieval world. Empress Matilda was one royal daughter who could certainly have used her mother's guidance throughout her early life. Matilda was born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and his wife, Matilda of Scotland. The young princess tragically lost her mother at age 7, leaving her completely exposed to the machinations of her powerful father. When Matilda was only 8 years old, King Henry arranged a betrothal to the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, who was more than 15 years her senior. The little princess was dispatched to Germany in 1110 to be raised at her future husband's court, where she received an education befitting an empress-to-be. The imperial couple married in 1114, despite the bride being only 12 years old. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda seemed destined for a life of greatness. But her husband died in 1125 after only 11 years of marriage. The widowed Matilda, still only 23, was suddenly left without a clear purpose. She had failed to bear the emperor a child, and his successor had no use for her presence. With few other options, Matilda was compelled to return to the court of her father, King Henry I. Matters became more dire for Matilda when her younger brother, Henry's only legitimate son, tragically drowned in the disastrous White Ship disaster of 1120. Suddenly, Henry had no clear male heir, and many of his barons were deeply uneasy at the thought of a woman inheriting the throne. But Henry pressed ahead with his plan. The determined king Henry forced his barons to swear an oath to accept Matilda as his legitimate heir. He then arranged a second marriage for the reluctant Matilda, this time to the 13 years younger Geoffrey of Anjou. It proved to be a tempestuous match, with the arrogant Matilda and the proud Geoffrey frequently quarreling. But the power couple eventually reconciled and produced 3 sons. When Henry I died in 1135, it appeared that Matilda's path to the English throne was clear, with Geoffrey acting as her consort and protector. But many of the barons reneged on their oath to Henry, and the throne was instead claimed by Henry's charming nephew, Stephen of Blois. Matilda was enraged at being bypassed. She gathered troops and supporters, leading them in an invasion of England in 1139. Matilda captured Stephen in battle in 1141, and for a few months actually ruled in London as Lady of the English. But her haughty demeanor quickly alienated the city's citizens, and she was soon forced to flee as Stephen's allies rallied. The resulting civil war and breakdown of royal authority, as Stephen's and Matilda's factions vied for control, became known as the Anarchy. For nearly 20 years, the two rivals continued to struggle and maneuver for advantage as the kingdom was engulfed in bloodshed and chaos. Contemporary chroniclers lamented that Christ and his saints slept as the brutal war dragged on. Finally, in 1153, the exhausted parties reached a compromise known as the Treaty of Winchester. Stephen would remain as king for the rest of his life, with Matilda's son Henry named as his official heir. The following year, Stephen died, and the 21-year-old Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, beginning a new, powerful era for England. Matilda herself retired quietly to Normandy, where she died in 1167 at the age of 65, knowing she fought like a lioness to place her son on the throne. In the end, she lost her long struggle to be queen in her own right, but through her descendants, including the formidable Henry II and the celebrated Richard the Lionheart, Matilda left a towering legacy over the English monarchy for generations to come. The saga of Matilda and Stephen demonstrates how uncertain even a seemingly ironclad royal succession could become in the chaos of the Middle Ages. With life expectancy so much lower than today, the death of a king could plunge a realm into disarray if the heir was too young, absent, or disputed. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Empress Matilda, who lived long enough, could wield great influence as queen mothers and regents for underage sons. Matilda's daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was especially skilled at using her power behind the throne to steer events, even dominating the royal court for a period. But such a prominent role for women was the exception rather than the rule in the deeply patriarchal society of medieval Europe. Women, even royal ones, were expected to be submissive, pious, and decorous, modeling the virtues of the ideal courtly lady. Those queens who openly flouted these expectations, asserting themselves too strongly into the male spheres of governance and warfare, frequently met with harsh criticism and public censure. Chroniclers denounced them as unnaturally ambitious viragos, overstepping their proper womanly role. This was vividly the case with Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Isabella, who was beautiful and clever, despised her ineffectual, pleasure-loving husband and his male favorites, who held undue influence at court. In 1325, Isabella fled to France, where she took a lover, the ambitious nobleman Roger Mortimer. The scandalous pair gathered an invasion force and attacked England, capturing the hapless Edward and forcing him to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. Edward II soon died in captivity, almost certainly murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. The pair then ruled openly as regents, their brazen affair an open secret. But young King Edward chafed under his mother's control. In a palace coup, he arrested Isabella and put her lover Mortimer on trial. The queen was spared execution and allowed to retire with dignity to a comfortable exile. Mortimer, however, was promptly hanged as a traitor. Isabella's story is a cautionary tale of how even powerful queens could swiftly fall from grace if they failed to maintain the proper image of virtuous femininity. In the harsh world of medieval politics, royalty danced on a razor's edge, where one wrong move could mean disgrace or death. When those missteps involved queens and their lovers, the scandal was a special interest to royal observers. By the later Middle Ages, most kings had resigned themselves to their wives taking discreet lovers, so long as they were reasonably cautious and bore the king's children. Of course, kings themselves frequently strayed with mistresses. It was practically expected for lusty royal husbands. Henry II of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine's spouse, famously kept a whole string of mistresses, most notably the fair Rosamund, the comely young daughter of a knight. Henry secreted his beloved Rosamund in a sort of love nest, a picturesque bower at the center of a hedge maze at his park in Woodstock. According to popular legend, a jealous Queen Eleanor eventually found a way into the labyrinth and confronted her young, nubile rival, offering her the choice of a dagger or a cup of poison. The tale's ominous implication of murder only added to the fair Rosamund's romantic mystique. The reality, as usual, was doubtless more prosaic. Some historians believe Rosamund may have become a nun with Eleanor's knowledge as a respectable way to remove her from the royal court. In any case, Rosamund apparently died of natural causes, as a charitable foundation was later established at Godstow Abbey in her name. The enduring legend of Rosamund and Eleanor demonstrates how tales of courtly love, with their adulterous passions, jealous rages, and tragic endings, so captivated the imaginations of the medieval nobility. Such scandalous romances, whether real or embellished, were a favorite gossip around palace fireplaces and banquet tables. So, where did medieval royals conduct most of their philandering and politicking? Much of it occurred at their favored royal residences and power bases. Kings, queens, and their courts were always on the move between castles, keeping a close eye on their far-flung domains. The great royal dwellings of the Middle Ages were not just military fortifications, but also political nerve centers and stages for court pageantry and intrigue. The mightiest castles boasted concentric rings of stout walls, towers, baileys, and keeps, plus lavish living quarters decked out in rich tapestries, fine furnishings, and precious plate. A splendid example was William the Conqueror's White Tower, begun in the 1070s, the first and largest building at the Tower of London complex. Though meant to dominate and intimidate William's new English subjects, the White Tower also functioned as a showy royal residence, complete with a magnificent great hall, stately apartments, and a lovely chapel. Many exquisite examples of medieval royal apartments still survive today. One of the most opulent was the Palais de la Cite in Paris, the main seat of the French monarchy from the 10th century until Charles V moved the court to the Louvre in the 1360s. The Palais de la Cite was a vast complex combining a fortress, a prison, law courts, and a dazzling royal residence. At its heart was a sumptuous grand salle, a vast, vaulted hall with soaring arches supported by colorful marble columns. The vault was famously painted a deep, inky blue, dotted with golden fleurs-de-lis, representing the night sky. Magnificent statues of French kings lined the walls, staring down regally at courtiers and visitors. Though the grand salle was largely destroyed by a fire in 1618, we can still marvel at one of its exquisite side chambers, the fairy tale Sainte-Chapelle. This glorious Gothic chapel was built by King Louis IX in the 1240s to house a supposed crown of thorns and other relics of Christ's Passion. The Sainte-Chapelle is famed for its dazzling stained glass windows, an ethereal expanse of luminous, jewel tones soaring nearly 100 feet above the marble floor. Brilliantly hued scenes from the Old Testament and the Passion psycho-mesmerize the eye with a wash of glowing color. Life for royalty in medieval times was a world unto itself, set apart from the toil and concerns of the common people. While the lives of kings and queens were undoubtedly privileged, full of luxury and power beyond imagining for most, they also carried heavy burdens and weighty expectations. Their daily routines were marked by strict ceremony, onerous duties, and constant public scrutiny. The royal lifestyle was at once decadent and demanding, a glittering facade masking very human struggles within. Perhaps no monarch better embodies the paradoxes of royalty than Queen Philippa of England, devoted wife of Edward III and mother to no fewer than 12 children. Born a noble woman of Hainaut, now in modern Belgium, the young Philippa came to England at just 13 to be wed to the 15-year-old Edward. It was an arranged match, like most royal marriages then, intended to secure a political alliance between their two lands. Yet, despite its pragmatic origins, the union would blossom into a deeply loving and influential partnership. Edward and Philippa's marriage was a pillar of strength during a tumultuous time for the English crown. Not long after taking the throne, Edward embroiled England in what would become the 100 Years' War, staking a tenuous claim to the French crown through his mother. As he led armies across the Channel year after year, Philippa often served as regent in his stead, capably governing the realm. She earned widespread respect for her wisdom, grace, and profound charity, a trusted queen who embodied the ideals of the age. But Philippa's life was far from the tranquil domesticity enjoyed by her humblest subjects. When not holding court or reviewing matters of state, she was frequently pregnant, confined to her chambers for long stretches. Childbirth was a perilous affair even for queens, and not all Philippa's babies would survive infancy. Those who did face an upbringing of rigid formality, every moment structured and supervised. The natural rambunctiousness of childhood was strictly tamed by decorum. Exhausting as the cycle of child-rearing was, it was also Philippa's chief duty and a source of dynastic pride. Her sons would go on to be the famed Black Prince and the powerful John of Gaunt. Her daughters she raised to be gracious and capable queens. In an age when the primary role of royal women was to secure the succession, Philippa excelled, yet she strove to be more than a queen. She made herself a true partner to Edward and an influential force in her own right, when not consumed by matters of state or family. Philippa embraced the refined pastimes and pageantry of court. She had a passion for fine clothing, and is said to have kept a wardrobe unmatched in opulence. She looked regal even by the sumptuous standards of 14th century nobility, swayed in jewels and billowing gowns. Music was another great love. Her court was constantly filled with minstrels and troubadours. She was a cultured patron of the arts and learning, collecting exquisite books and objets d'art from the continent. Yet Philippa also took her Christian faith most seriously, as any proper monarch must in medieval times. She devoted long hours to prayer and masses in the royal chapel and practiced charity on a grand scale, befitting her station. Her touching concern for the poor was much remarked upon, and convents, hospitals, and almshouses across England enjoyed her support. She was forever interceding with the king for mercy on prisoners or pardon for condemned criminals. Hers was a gentle and moderating influence on the throne. Thus, even a queen renowned for her virtue had to walk a delicate line, balancing piety and dynastic duty, stately glamour and common compassion. Whether ensconced in sumptuous apartments attended by scores of ladies or on her knees in solemn prayer, Philippa had to be every inch the queen at all times, gracious but commanding, admirable from every angle. Edward appeared to adore her, remained relatively faithful, and mourned her most deeply at her passing. Yet he did take a mistress in her lifetime. One could only expect so much of a king. This was the central paradox of a queen's life. She must project an image of unassailable majesty, yet in truth, even her marriage was a political contract first and foremost. She must bear as many heirs as she could and raise them to rule, yet forever live apart from them and their simple childhood delights. She must act as intercessor for her people, yet never forget her place far above them. She enjoyed comforts and luxuries unthinkable to most, yet kingly whims might negate them at any time. To be royal was to live atop a pedestal, resplendent to behold, but confined on all sides. When English subjects gazed up and saw Philippa and her family in all their finery, they saw mythic figures more than flesh and blood. When we look back from our vantage point today, it can be hard to see past the crowns and castles and courtly fanfare. But Philippa's story reminds us that inside the royal robes beat a human heart with cares and contradictions not so different from our own. So come, let us return to halls of Windsor and feel like 14th century royalty for a moment. Imagine yourself in the embroidered velvet gown, rubies and sapphires sparkling at your throat, a golden circlet upon your brow. Minstrels play a delicate air on viol and lute, while you dine on glazed peacock and marchpane subtleties. Your children scamper off to the gardens for a game of cups and balls. Later, knights will joust for your honor in the tilt yard. But linger not over long on these pleasant scenes, for affairs of state await in the council chamber, and the clerics have endless documents to be reviewed and sealed. A crowd of petitioners gathers in the outer ward, begging justice and favor. There are disputes to settle between fractious lords, and the Scots are raiding the northern marches again. Your eldest son, still just a youth, must ride out to France and the battlefield, and all the while you feel a new babe quickening in your womb. Such is the life for medieval royalty. The great wheel of history turns on, and we must turn with it, leaving Philippa and her vanished world behind. But let us carry with us a certain empathy for those long-ago lords and ladies, for in the dark, behind our closed eyelids, we may yet catch a glimpse of them in their private chambers, stripped of regalia and reputation. And there, we might recognize kindred spirits, more like us than the storybooks suggest. The crown weighs heavy, but the humanity within endures. The crown jewels, of course, were among the most prized symbols of royal wealth and majesty during medieval times. These priceless coronation regalia, crowns, orbs, scepters, and swords, were encrusted with glittering rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds the size of quail eggs. They were worn by the monarch during the most solemn ceremonies and state occasions. Kings and queens took great pride in commissioning ever more opulent crown jewels, each one more dazzling than the last. Such ostentatious displays of riches weren't just for vanity's sake. They were calculated political statements meant to awe subjects and rivals alike with the vast resources at the sovereign's command. In an era before mass media, the bedazzling spectacle of a monarch decked out in jewel-encrusted finery was a powerful propaganda tool. It powerfully reinforced the divine right of kings, the sacred notion that rulers were formally anointed by God to reign over their kingdoms. The crown jewels directly invoke biblical sovereigns like Solomon, famed not only for their wisdom but also for their stupendous material wealth and earthly glory. When worn within majestic cathedrals during holy festivals, they linked the worldly might of the monarchy to the spiritual authority of the church. And when conspicuously flaunted before foreign emissaries, they served as a brilliant advertisement for the prosperity, sophistication, and unyielding strength of the realm. Amassing such fabulous royal treasuries was an extremely expensive endeavor. Skilled craftsmen devoted years to perfecting a single piece. The precious metals and gemstones were sourced from the farthest corners of the known world. Gold from Africa, rubies from Asia, and emeralds from Egypt. Such far-flung origins only enhanced the mystique and legendary value of the jewels. The greatest medieval goldsmiths and lapidaries, experts in working with precious metals and gems, were lured to royal courts with promises of generous salaries, lavish workshops, and exalted titles. In some kingdoms, these master artisans acquired an almost priestly status. Their arcane knowledge of metallurgy and gem-cutting was regarded as akin to alchemy. Different cultures developed their own distinctive styles of royal regalia. The Holy Roman Emperor sported an octagonal crown, perhaps mimicking the walls of Jerusalem. Byzantines favored pendilia, which were bejeweled ornaments designed to hang from the crown over the ruler's cheeks and ears. English kings often carried scepters topped with a cross or a dove, symbolizing just and peaceful sovereignty. Protecting such immensely valuable royal possessions was paramount. The crown jewels were rigorously locked away in the deepest castle vaults, guarded around the clock by the most trusted and incorruptible soldiers. Merely to handle them, without express permission, was considered treasonous. But for all the best efforts of even the most eagle-eyed warders, the dazzling allure of the jewels sometimes proved too tempting. In 1303, the royal treasury at Westminster Abbey was daringly robbed. The golden crowns, scepters, and rings of Edward the Confessor were stolen by a mysterious band of thieves. As sacrilegious as the crime was, one can almost admire the sheer audacity of these bandits, who were bold enough to make off with the most jealously guarded treasures in all the land. The repercussions were swift and terrible. Every able-bodied man in London was ordered to assist with the hunt. The city gates were sealed for days. Dozens of suspects were rounded up, and one presumes the jailers weren't overly concerned about observing Magna Carta rights. Though most of the jewels were eventually recovered, the original crown was damaged beyond repair. This legendary heist later inspired many a ballad and morality tale, with the enduring moral being, of course, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a thief to escape the king's justice. For commoners, even glimpsing the crown jewels was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Perhaps a chance peek as the royal procession wound its way to Westminster for a coronation, or a tantalizing glint of gold as the monarch sat enthroned in full regalia. Ironically then, for most medieval folk, the royal crown jewels were like that famous Arthurian quest object, a glimpse of the Holy Grail, radiant and otherworldly, but forever out of reach behind castle walls. Yet, how marvelous it must have been to dream about those huge, hypnotically sparkling gemstones, the warm glow of that soft, lustrous, beaten gold, the sheer majesty embodied in each priceless, timeless treasure. However much the jewels bedazzled the public imagination, for the royals themselves, they could sometimes be a weighty reminder of the burdens of kingship. The 11th century German king Henry III reportedly despised wearing his crown as it gave him headaches. The 13th century English monarch John was said to have pawned his jewels to finance his disastrous wars, a clear sign of spendthrift and desperate ways. Perhaps it was a relief to set aside the heavy crown at the end of a long ceremonial day. But even in private, royalty couldn't entirely escape the regalia. They wore smaller jeweled diadems and coronets as part of their everyday attire. Their furniture and table were festooned with gold and silver. Jewels glittered from every scabbard, goblet, and slipper. Such all-encompassing opulence was customary and expected. A medieval king couldn't very well greet the Venetian ambassadors wearing a monk's rough-spun robes and drinking from a wooden bowl. Royalty had an image to uphold, one synonymous with the finest things in life, meant to mirror God's heavenly splendor and awe the masses into obedience. In a world characterized by backbreaking poverty for most, rulers had to both look and live the part of the elect, a race of gilded demigods draped in the most precious earthly treasures known to man. As much as we moderns might raise an eyebrow at such conspicuous consumption, there's no denying the sheer aesthetic pleasure of these magnificent artifacts. Just picture the coronation crown of the Holy Roman Empire, a soaring gold affair studded with sapphires, pearls, and an enormous ocean blue aquamarine. Or the Alfred jewel, the Anglo-Saxon amulet with its enigmatic enamel portrait, as vividly colored as the day it was fired. These sublime treasures still have the power to enchant and inspire. And though the kings and queens who once wore them are long gone, the crown jewels remain tangible symbols of the wealth, power, and glory of royalty in times past. More than mere ornaments, they are the glittering stuff of legends. Of course, not all royal treasures were as flashy as gem-encrusted crowns. Monarchs also cherished more understated heirlooms that were no less significant. Take the coronation spoon, used to anoint English sovereigns with holy oil, a battered little silver thing about as plain as a bean spoon. But it dated back to the 12th century and was believed to be the only relic to survive the plundering of the crown jewels in the English Civil War. As such, it was imbued with sacral and historic value far beyond its appearance. Or consider the bizarre Richaw sword and scabbard, a 10th century German weapon with an ornate scabbard of chased silver pattern with fantastical faces melting into each other. Scholars still argue whether the unsettling designs were meant to evoke the souls of warriors devoured by the blade or a kingly lineage dissolving into the next. In any case, it is a sublimely eerie piece of craftsmanship and a window into the more outre side of medieval aesthetics. But such grim-seeming oddities were the exception in royal treasure hoards. For the most part, the emphasis was firmly on displays of wealth, beauty, and exquisite workmanship that attested to the refinement and might of the ruling class. Where commoners made do with crudely thatched huts, rag clothing, and simple leather utensils, the king and his court enjoyed the ne plus ultra in every department. The most intricate tapestries, the most towering Gothic cathedrals, the most beguiling music. Luxuries like spices, silks, and stained glass were imported at staggering expense from the far reaches of the globe. Teams of tailors, goldsmiths, and furniture makers were kept on permanent retainer to furnish an endless stream of sumptuous goods. The royal wardrobe alone was vast enough to clothe a small city, from ermine-trimmed robes to jeweled slippers to gold-plated underpants. No wonder that for the average swineherd or scullery maid, the royal lifestyle seemed as impossibly remote and marvelous as that of archangels or fairy kings. And no wonder that the ultimate fairy tale ending was for a humble hero to ascend to royalty, whether by pulling a sword from a stone, marrying a prince, or simply waking to discover it had all been a beautiful dream. Yet, even in their finest silks and most pompous ceremonies, medieval monarchs were only flesh and blood. They weren't immune to the same everyday ailments, emotions, and indignities as the lowliest peasant. One can picture the royals nursing headaches after too much Rhenish wine, or discreetly scratching their lice-ridden wigs, or grumpily changing out of those stiff, brocaded tunics into something a tad more comfortable. It's this human touch that makes them relatable across the yawning centuries. Underneath all the padded pomp and circumstance, kings and queens worry about their unruly offspring, griped about their gambling debts, and suffer from indigestion just like anyone else. They simply did so while swanning about in palatial splendor and sporting gem-studded undergarments. So as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of those long-ago lords and ladies holding court in halls hung with unicorn tapestries, supping on gold-flecked pies and rose-petal puddings, dancing the farandole by candlelight in velvet sleeves and pearl-sewn veils. A world of wonders as fabulous and far off as an illuminated page from a book of hours, yet inhabited by royals who were just as human as you or I, once they prized off their crowns. Good night, sweet princes and princesses of the distant past, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. As we've seen, the lives of medieval monarchs were filled with grand ceremony and courtly splendor, but also weighty responsibilities and deep religious devotion. Perhaps no rulers embodied these contrasts quite like the 14th century English king Edward III and his queen consort Philippa of Hainaut. Edward was crowned at the tender age of 14 after the forced abdication of his father. Edward II, the young king, quickly proved himself a capable ruler and military commander, leading England into the early stages of what would become the 100 Years' War with France. Edward asserted his claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, the so-called she-wolf of France. This conflict would consume much of Edward's reign and come to define the chivalric ideals of his court. Alongside her ambitious husband, Queen Philippa presided over a glittering royal household teeming with nobles, courtiers, servants, and visiting dignitaries. Philippa was no passive consort. she actively engaged in diplomacy, even personally negotiating a truce with Scotland while Edward was away campaigning in France. The Queen was also a noted patron of the arts, particularly minstrels and musicians. Her influence helped shape the elegant, refined court culture for which she and Edward became renowned. Of course, the glamour and power couple dynamics of Edward and Philippa's marriage didn't preclude them from fulfilling the primary duty expected of any royal pair, producing heirs. And in this, they certainly rose to the occasion. Philippa bore a remarkable 12 children in total, including 5 sons who survived to adulthood. The eldest, Edward of Woodstock, would earn fame as the Black Prince and father the future King Richard II. Through Philippa's many daughters, the Plantagenet dynasty forged vital marital alliances across Europe. For all the splendor and intrigue that swirled around them, Edward and Philippa seem to have enjoyed a surprisingly stable and affectionate union by the standards of medieval royalty. Unlike his philandering father, Edward III never kept an official mistress. He relied on Philippa as a trusted political advisor and companion. According to some accounts, as the Queen lay on her deathbed, the grief-stricken Edward dutifully held her hand for several days until she passed. Even before Philippa's death in 1369, Edward began to withdraw from public life as he entered old age. The capable leader who embodied the chivalric ideal had grown increasingly infirm in both body and mind. During his final years, he fell under the influence of his grasping mistress, Alice Perrers, who purportedly plundered the royal treasuries. When Edward himself died in 1377, the once glorious Plantagenet dynasty he and Philippa had built teetered on the brink of chaos. Their great-grandson, Richard II, would prove ill-suited to the throne, eventually deposed by rebellious nobles. But despite the turmoil that followed, the legacies of Edward III and Queen Philippa endured. It was Edward who first established English as the official language of his royal court, a shift away from the French that had long been favored by the Norman elite. He also founded the prestigious Order of the Garter, still the world's oldest national order of knighthood. For her part, Philippa popularized the name Philippa itself in England, where it had been quite rare, but now took its place in the royal rolls. Even more than their tangible impacts, Edward and Philippa came to embody an ideal of enlightened monarchy, ruling with a mix of piety, chivalry, patronage, and power. In later centuries, when the Tudors and Stuarts looked back to forge an English identity, they often invoked Edward as a model king, a paragon of both warrior courage and courtly grace, presiding over a flourishing medieval realm. That these images tend to gloss over the more complicated realities of Edward's reign attests to the lasting pull of Plantagenet legend. Regal power in the Middle Ages was so often a family affair, the fate of bloodlines and kingdoms bound together in a great generational chess match. For Edward III and Philippa, whatever personal affection they may have shared was always interwoven with hard-nosed political calculation. Their marriage joined England to Philippa's native county of Hainaut, creating a vital early alliance in the 100 Years' War to come. These same dynastic imperatives meant that royal children were often treated more as political game pieces than beloved family members. Even for an evidently doting mother like Philippa, her daughters were destined to be used as bargaining chips. Their marriages were often auctioned off to the most promising bidder. Princesses were routinely packed off to distant lands as young as 10 or 12 to cement an alliance or claim a throne. Such was the case for Edward and Philippa's second daughter, the Princess Isabella. At the age of just 13, Isabella was dispatched to Gascony to marry Edward's close ally, the Lord of Coucy. The young girl's lavish wedding in 1365 served as much a show of English wealth and power as a marriage ceremony. Poor Isabella's elaborate trousseau filled an entire ship, while her dowry of 4,000 marks required another vessel to transport. The Lord of Coucy was so impressed by this ostentatious display, he voluntarily became an English vassal on the spot. Marital statecraft aside, the sheer act of giving birth was a crucial role, indeed a risky duty, for any medieval queen. With minimal understanding of hygiene and medicine, childbed presented mortal peril for even the most exalted woman. Doubtless, even Philippa, who enjoyed the era's most advanced obstetric care, felt a shiver of dread each time her belly swelled with child. Perhaps she whispered a prayer to St. Margaret, the patron saint of pregnant women, or clutched an amulet of precious stones believed to aid in delivery. Of course, as with so many aspects of medieval life, royal births were witnessed by many and imbued with great political significance. When her time drew near, Philippa would take her chamber, retire with her ladies to await labor in a darkened room sealed tightly against evil humors. As soon as a new prince or princess issued forth, bells pealed and bonfires blazed to celebrate another successful act of dynastic continuity. And a beaming Edward would dispatch riders to spread news of his expanded brood to all corners of the realm. For royal and peasant alike, children were the keys to power, whether that meant an heir to carry on a royal lineage or simply extra hands to work the land. But even the most illustrious bloodlines must someday end. Edward III outlived both his beloved queen and his eldest son, the famed Black Prince. He died a dribbling shell of his former self, the realm he'd once commanded already slipping into discord. There's a certain poetic symmetry to the fact that Edward was ultimately succeeded by his young grandson, Richard II, who was himself deposed and probably murdered. In the end, even the mightiest medieval monarch was made of the same breakable flesh and blood as the lowliest serf. The royal crown was always a heavy burden to bear, even when lined with the softest ermine. Perhaps there's cold comfort to be found in that essential equality. Whatever our station in life, we all grow, strive, scheme, and hurt. We love and we lose. We play our role upon fortune's stage for a brief hour, and then are heard no more. Kings and peasants alike return to the same silent dust from whence we came. And yet, some royal sparkle still catches the eye across the ages, in a heraldic line stitched on a moldering banner, or the entwined initials illuminated in a book of hours, in the ghostly chivalry of a poem praising long-dead knights and ladies. The traces linger like the scent of incense in a drafty chapel or the half-remembered remnants of a dream upon waking, a dream of caparisoned steeds prancing down a tilt-yard, of minstrels' melodies echoing in a rushes-strewn hall, of a gentle queen dispensing alms to the poor with a gracious hand. The clamor and pageantry fades into night's blessed hush, while somewhere in the distant darkness, a monarchy endures. As the sun sets over the medieval kingdom, the castle grows quiet and still. The day's labor is complete. The monarch and their court retire to their private chambers to unwind and prepare for the night ahead. For royalty, even these intimate moments maintain an air of refinement and ritual. Servants would assist the king and queen in changing out their finery and into their sleeping attire. Luxurious nightgowns and robes of fine linen or silk, perhaps trimmed with delicate lace or fur, were donned. A chambermaid would brush out the queen's long hair with slow, soothing strokes until it shone like spun gold in the flickering candlelight. The king might sit pensively by the fire, sipping a gobble of warm, spiced wine as a page removed his shoes. These private quarters were the ultimate sanctuary where royalty could let their guard down away from prying eyes. Here, in the innermost chambers, the trappings of wealth and status were more understated. Tapestries depicting serene gardens and religious scenes adorned the walls, while plush carpets cushioned the stone floors. The massive canopied bed was pile high with embroidered pillows and blankets, an inviting cocoon promising a restful night's sleep. Before retiring, the monarch might linger over private correspondence at their writing desk or pore over state documents one last time. A confessor would arrive to hear the royal confession and offer a blessing. Finally, with a weary sigh, the king and queen would slide into bed and draw the heavy velvet curtains close around them, shutting out the world. As sleep descended, one wonders what filled the dreams of these powerful rulers. Did they envision victories on the battlefield, grand castles rising in their kingdoms, their legacy stretching to the centuries? Or perhaps in sleep, they were simply ordinary men and women, rejoicing, grieving, hoping, and loving just like any other. Kings and commoners alike looked peaceful in slumber, the burdens and blessings of their lives temporarily forgotten. Though we often imagine royalty living in unimaginable splendor, in truth, their lives were an inseparable blend of pageantry and privacy, responsibility and repose. To peer through the gates of a castle is to realize that within those thick stone walls, behind the crowns and gowns, beat hearts not so different from our own. The storied walls of England's Leeds Castle could tell such tales of royal humanity. For this moated manor hosted many medieval monarchs over the centuries. Built in 1119 by the Norman Lord Robert de Crevecoeur, Leeds passed into royal ownership under King Edward I in 1278. This Castle of Queens, Queen of Castles, as it was known, became a favorite retreat of Edward's queen, Eleanor of Castile. Eleanor was renowned for her beauty, intelligence, and fierce devotion to Edward, a Spanish princess. She was the English prince at the tender age of 13 and stood loyally by his side as he ascended the throne and fought wars in Wales and Scotland. Together, the royal couple had an impressive 16 children, securing the Plantagenet dynasty. Tragedy struck in 1290 when, traveling to join Edward on campaign, the 49-year-old Eleanor fell ill with a quartan fever. The king rushed to her bedside at the manor of Harby, but there was nothing to be done. As Edward cradled his beloved wife, Eleanor slipped away, leaving the king utterly bereft. "I loved her tenderly in her lifetime," Edward lamented. "I do not cease to love her now she is dead." In his all-consuming grief, the king erected 12 elaborate stone crosses. At each place, Eleanor's funeral procession stopped on its journey from Lincoln to London. The Eleanor crosses were Gothic masterpieces, soaring monuments to an extraordinary queen and an enduring royal love. Though only fragments remain today, these crosses stand as a testament to the beating heart inside the crown. For all their wealth and power, the royals of medieval times were not immune to the joys and sorrows that comprise mortal life. They too suffered losses and delighted in triumphs, experienced despair, and found hope renewed. Next time you gaze upon a crumbling castle or weather-worn statue, remember the human stories, the laughter and the tears woven into the very fabric of history. As we wander through the dreamscape of the past, we find connection with our royal predecessors, not in their crowns and castles, but in our common humanity. And so we bid good night to the kings and queens of old, knowing we share one thing above all, the need for rest at the end of a long day. The candles gutter out, the castle sleeps, and history marches ever onward. Good night, dear viewer, and may your dreams be as sweet as a royal lullaby from long ago.